My entitled son got us kicked out of our Bahamas hotel, so I threw his suitcase in a lake. My 24-year-old son Andrew still lives at home, doesn't drive, can't cook, and gets a $1,500 weekly allowance. My wife created this monster by overruling every boundary I tried to set. When he was 12, he bullied poor kids at school. I grounded him. Wife ungrounded him. When he demanded designer everything, I said no. Wife said yes. When he turned 21 and demanded his allowance increase from $1,000 to $1,500 weekly, I refused. Wife gave it to him anyway. This year for my birthday, we went to the Bahamas as a family. Andrew immediately complained it was too hot for his designer jackets, that he had to dress like the brokies. My wife rushed to buy him designer tropical wear. For 3 days, he threw tantrums at restaurants, complained constantly, slept until 3 p.m., then got mad we did activities without him, and was rude to hotel staff. On my actual birthday, he refused to join us for dinner at a seafood restaurant, calling it lousy. We left him money for room service. Midway through dinner, the hotel called. We were banned, our belongings at the front desk. Andrew had somehow gotten mushrooms and alcohol. Never having done drugs before, he went insane. Destroyed every bed in our suite, broke mirrors, punched holes in walls, then ran through the lobby in his underwear screaming at guests before vomiting everywhere and passing out. Medics had to be called. The hotel said we were lucky they weren't pressing charges. We collected our stuff and checked into a cheap motel. Next morning, Andrew acted like nothing happened. Got a little carried away, he said, no apology, just complaining that he'd lost a fake nail and the motel was crappy. When he asked when we'd get back to a real hotel, I lost it. Called him ungrateful, a disappointment. My wife tried defending him, and I exploded at her too. Told her she'd created a man-child who couldn't survive the real world. Then I grabbed his suitcase from under the bed and walked outside. Andrew followed, asking what I was doing. The motel sat beside a lake. As I approached it, he realized my intention and started screaming. I threw that suitcase as far as I could, his MacBooks, designer clothes, makeup, skincare, everything he valued, gone. Andrew had a complete meltdown, jumped in after it, then remembered he couldn't swim and had to retreat. My wife sided with him, of course. I booked myself a flight home alone and left them there. But at the airport, going through security, TSA pulled me aside. They found pills in my carry-on I didn't pack, the same mushrooms Andrew had taken. My blood went cold. They were planted in my bag. Security detained me while I tried explaining, but who believes the "those aren't mine" defense? They let me make one call. I called my wife, panicked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Andrew didn't get those drugs in the Bahamas. He brought them from home, from your home office. What? I don't have the pills you take for your back pain, the oxycodone. Andrew's been stealing them for months, crushing them up. That's what he took at the hotel. That's what's in your bag. You knew he was stealing my prescription medication? I thought he was just experimenting. He planted drugs in my bag, at an airport. He didn't plant anything. I put them there. The words hit like ice water. You planted drugs on me? You threw thousands of dollars of his belongings in a lake. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? I put a small amount in your bag this morning, just enough to delay you, teach you a lesson. I could go to prison. They'll let you go. First offense, small amount. Meanwhile, we're using your credit cards to replace everything you destroyed. I checked my phone. 17 purchase confirmations. Over $30,000 in charges. This is insane. I'm calling our lawyer. With what money? I emptied our joint accounts this morning. Moved everything to my personal account. That's theft. It's marital assets. I'm protecting them from someone who's become unstable. Throwing luggage in lakes? Getting arrested for drugs? Any judge would side with me. My phone buzzed. An email from her divorce attorney. Papers already filed. You're divorcing me? Over Andrew? The house is in my name, remember? My inheritance bought it. She was right. Her family money bought everything. I'd worked my entire career, contributed everything I earned, but legally, she controlled it all. Oh, and check your work email. I switched over. An email from HR. Subject: termination of employment, drug-related arrest. They'd already found out. Zero tolerance policy. 20 years with the company. Gone. How did they? I called them. Concerned wife reporting her husband's drug problem. I stood in the detention room, phone shaking. You destroyed my entire life. For Andrew. No, sweetheart. This isn't about Andrew. Her voice changed, colder than I'd ever heard it. Check our bedroom security camera, the app on your phone. Go back to last Tuesday, 2 a.m. I pulled up the app with trembling fingers. There I was, sleepwalking into our room. I'd been doing it for years, a harmless condition. But in the video, I was doing something else. Talking. Clear as day. Should have gotten rid of them both. The accident should have worked. Next time, no survivors. My blood froze. What accident? What is this? The car accident, 7 years ago, when Andrew and I went off the road. You said the brakes failed, but you worked on the car that morning, didn't you? I stood in that airport detention room while the TSA agent waited by the door, my phone still pressed to my ear even though Tamara had already hung up. The walls were that industrial beige color that government buildings always use, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making everything feel unreal. I tried to replay what she'd just told me, but my brain kept skipping like a damaged recording. She planted drugs in my bag, filed for divorce, emptied our accounts, got me fired. Claims I tried to kill them 7 years ago. The agent cleared his throat and gestured toward the hallway. I followed him through a maze of corridors, past other travelers being questioned, past security monitors showing endless footage of people removing shoes and laptops. He deposited me in a smaller room with a metal table and 2 chairs, then left without a word. I sat there for what felt like hours, checking my phone every few minutes. The purchase notifications kept coming. Andrew's new MacBook Pro, designer sunglasses, luxury skincare set. Each alert was another few hundred or $1,000 vanishing from accounts I could no longer access. Around hour 3, I called Dylan. We'd been roommates in college, stayed close even after he moved 2 states away for work. He answered on the second ring, and I tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out jumbled and desperate. He didn't ask questions, just said he'd make some calls and figure out the bail situation. Hour 4, a different agent brought me lukewarm coffee in a paper cup. Hour 5, my phone battery hit 15%. Hour 6, Dylan called back with the name of a bail bondsman who'd post the $15,000. The paperwork took another 40 minutes. When they finally released me, Dylan was waiting in the pickup zone in his old sedan, hazard lights flashing. I collapsed into the passenger seat and just sat there staring at the airport terminal through the windshield. Dylan pulled into traffic and I started talking, the whole nightmare spilling out in broken pieces. The birthday trip, Andrew's hotel destruction, throwing the suitcase in the lake, the planted pills, Tamara's phone call, the divorce papers, the job termination, the bank accounts, the sleepwalking video. He listened without interrupting, his hands steady on the wheel, and when I finally ran out of words, he just nodded and said I could stay with him as long as I needed. The drive took 3 hours. I dozed off somewhere around mile 40 and woke up when we pulled into his apartment complex. He lived in a decent place, 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor with a view of the parking lot. The spare bedroom had a futon, a bookshelf, and a window that didn't quite close all the way. Dylan brought me a pillow and blanket, then left me alone. I sat on the futon and opened my banking app. Personal checking showed $847. 32. That was it. Everything else was gone. No job, no home access, pending criminal charges for drug possession at an airport, and a wife who'd orchestrated my destruction in under 24 hours. I pulled up the divorce papers again and read through them properly this time. Tamara was claiming I'd become unstable and dangerous, citing the luggage incident as evidence of violent behavior. She was requesting full ownership of all marital assets, which legally she already controlled anyway since her inheritance money had purchased everything. I had contributed my entire salary for 20 years, paid for renovations and maintenance and property taxes, but none of it mattered because her name was on the deeds and titles. The house, the cars, the investment accounts, all hers. I switched to my work email and read the termination notice again. Effective immediately due to arrest on drug-related charges. 0 tolerance policy. 20 years of service, performance reviews that consistently rated me as exceeding expectations, none of it counted against a drug arrest at an airport. HR had already disabled my access to company systems and email. My work laptop would need to be returned within 5 business days. I lay back on the futon and stared at the ceiling, trying to remember that morning 7 years ago when I'd supposedly sabotaged the car. I remembered Tamara and Andrew getting ready for their weekend trip to the mountains. I remembered going out to the driveway to check the car before they left, something I always did before long drives. I remembered checking the oil level, the tire pressure, topping off the windshield washer fluid. But the brake lines? I had no memory of touching them, no memory of doing anything that would cause them to fail. The accident had happened 6 hours into their trip, on a steep mountain descent. Tamara called me from the hospital, voice shaking, saying the brakes had failed and they'd gone off the road. The car rolled twice. Andrew had a broken collarbone and some cuts. Tamara had bruised ribs and a concussion. They were lucky to be alive. The insurance investigation concluded it was mechanical failure, brake line corrosion due to age and road salt exposure. I'd accepted that explanation because it made sense. The car was 8 years old. We lived in an area that used salt on winter roads. Brake lines corroded over time. But now Tamara was saying I'd tampered with them, that I'd tried to kill them, that I'd confessed to it while sleepwalking just last Tuesday. I pulled up the security camera app and navigated to last Tuesday at 2 a.m. The video loaded and there I was, walking into our bedroom in my pajamas, eyes half closed in that blank way I looked when sleepwalking. I'd been doing it since my 20s, a sleep disorder my doctor said was harmless. I'd walk around the house, sometimes talk, never remember any of it the next morning. Tamara had gotten used to it years ago, would just guide me back to bed if she found me wandering. But in this video, I wasn't just wandering. I was standing beside our bed, looking down at where Tamara was sleeping and speaking in that flat, monotone voice I apparently used while asleep. The words were clear enough that the security camera microphone picked them up. Should have gotten rid of them both. The accident should have worked. Next time, no survivors. Then I turned and walked back out of the room, still asleep, and the video ended. I watched it 3 more times, my hands shaking worse each time. That was my voice, my body. But I had absolutely no memory of it, and the words themselves made no sense. Why would I want them dead? Yes, Andrew was spoiled and entitled, and Tamara had enabled every bit of it, but wanting them dead? Trying to kill them? That wasn't me. That had never been me. I fell asleep sometime after midnight and woke to Dylan knocking on the door around 8 a.m. He'd made coffee and said he had the name of a criminal defense attorney who might take my case. I showered in his bathroom, put on the same clothes from yesterday since I had no others, and tried to make myself look presentable. Dylan drove me to the attorney's office downtown, a small practice on the 3rd floor of an older building. Hunter Price met us in the lobby, mid-40s with graying hair and a firm handshake. His office was cramped but organized, law books lining the walls, a desk covered in case files. He gestured for me to sit and asked me to start from the beginning. I walked him through everything: the Bahamas trip, Andrew's drug-fueled hotel destruction, throwing the suitcase in the lake, the airport arrest, Tamara's phone confession about planting the pills, the divorce filing, the job termination, the emptied bank accounts, the credit card charges. Hunter took notes on a legal pad, his expression getting darker as I explained how everything had happened in coordinated sequence. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and tapped his pen against the notepad. He said the phone confession would have been incredibly valuable evidence if I'd recorded it, but without a recording, it was just my word against hers. The physical evidence was clear. Pills were found in my bag at airport security. I had a legitimate prescription for the same medication, which established access. A prosecutor would argue I brought them myself, either for personal use or distribution. Tamara's word that she planted them wouldn't overcome the physical evidence, especially since she could just deny ever saying it. Hunter leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked if I had any memory of tampering with the brakes that morning 7 years ago. The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. I sat there trying to process that he was actually asking if I'd tried to kill my wife and son. I told him no, absolutely not. I had zero memory of doing anything to those brake lines. I explained that I loved my family despite all our problems, despite Andrew being spoiled and Tamara enabling him. I never wanted them dead. The thought made me sick. Hunter nodded and wrote something on his legal pad. He said he had to ask because prosecutors would definitely ask the same thing if this ever went to court. Then he explained something that made me feel slightly less panicked. Sleepwalking confessions aren't admissible as evidence in criminal court because sleep-talking doesn't represent conscious thought or reliable memory. People say all kinds of things while asleep, random phrases, fears, things they saw on TV. None of it means anything real. But then he added the bad news. Tamara could still use that video to paint a narrative in divorce proceedings, make me look unstable and dangerous, even if it couldn't be used criminally. At least custody wasn't an issue since Andrew was 24 and not a minor. Hunter said his immediate priority had to be the drug charge because that carried actual criminal penalties that could put me in prison. Everything else was civil matters that could be fought later. He asked for permission to contact my pharmacy and request my full prescription records. I gave him the information, and he made the call right there from his office. The pharmacist pulled up my account and confirmed I'd been prescribed 60 oxycodone pills monthly for 3 years for chronic back pain from a work injury. Hunter put the call on speaker so I could hear. The records showed I refilled on schedule every single month, never early, no red flags in the system. I'd been a completely normal patient following my prescription exactly as written. But then Hunter pointed out something I hadn't considered. If Andrew had been stealing pills regularly like Tamara said, my supply should have run short. I should have needed refills early or complained to my doctor about running out. The fact that I didn't meant either Andrew wasn't stealing as many as Tamara claimed, or I wasn't taking my full prescribed dose. I felt my face get hot as I admitted the truth. I often only took half doses or skipped days entirely when the pain was manageable. I'd been scared of becoming dependent on opioids, so I tried to use as little as possible. Some months, I barely used 20 pills out of the 60. That meant Andrew could have been stealing 30 or 40 pills every month for 8 months, and I never would have noticed the bottles emptying faster than expected. Hunter wrote this down and said it actually helped my case. It showed I wasn't abusing my prescription or dependent on the medication. A person with a drug problem would take every pill and need early refills, not ration them carefully and skip doses. But it also confirmed Andrew had easy access to significant quantities over a long period. Hunter said we needed to document Andrew's drug use pattern and connect it directly to the pills found in my bag at the airport. He recommended hiring a private investigator named Ronan McPherson, who specialized in tracking drug acquisition and use patterns. Ronan apparently had connections with dealers and users, could interview people in Andrew's social circle, build a timeline of his drug use. I asked how much that would cost, and Hunter said probably $3,000 to $5,000, depending on how long the investigation took. I thought about my bank account with $847 and wanted to throw up. Hunter saw my face and said Dylan had already offered to cover investigator fees, that he'd called before I arrived and insisted on helping. I made a mental note to figure out how to repay Dylan for everything he was doing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. 17 missed calls from Tamara, 12 missed calls from Andrew, 3 calls from numbers I didn't recognize. My voicemail was full. Hunter told me not to answer any of them and not to communicate with Tamara or Andrew directly from this point forward. Everything needed to go through attorneys once I hired a divorce lawyer, which needed to happen immediately. He gave me Martina Santoro's contact information and said she was the best divorce attorney he knew who might take my case given my financial situation. I asked if I should at least listen to the voicemails, and Hunter said absolutely not. Tamara was probably trying to get me to say something incriminating that she could record and use against me. Andrew might be trying to manipulate me into dropping charges or forgiving him. The unknown numbers could be reporters if Tamara had leaked the story, or investigators working for her attorney. Delete everything without listening, Hunter said. I did it right there, watching all the notifications disappear. Dylan picked me up from Hunter's office and drove me to a different bank across town. We opened a new account at an institution where Tamara had no access or history. I transferred my remaining $847, which took about 10 minutes and felt pathetic. This was everything I had left after 20 years of marriage and a solid career. Dylan then drove me to 3 different credit card companies where I tried to freeze the joint accounts and report Tamara's charges as unauthorized. The first 2 representatives told me the same thing. Tamara had already called them that morning and reported the cards as joint marital accounts, where both parties had equal charging authority. The $30,000 in purchases for Andrew's replacement designer items were technically legal under marital property laws because we were still married when the charges occurred, and both our names were on the accounts. The third company said I could file a dispute, but it would likely be denied for the same reasons. I asked about freezing the cards to prevent future charges, and they said Tamara had already done that from her end, which gave her control. Hunter called while we were at the third credit card office, and I put him on speaker. He said he'd researched the marital property laws, and the credit card companies were right. Unless I could prove Tamara made the charges specifically to harm me rather than for legitimate marital expenses, which would be nearly impossible, the money was gone. He said to document everything anyway, because it might help in divorce proceedings to show her retaliatory pattern. That night, I lay in Dylan's spare bedroom staring at the ceiling and trying to remember that morning 7 years ago. I could picture myself in the garage with our car, the silver sedan Tamara drove back then. I remembered checking the tire pressure with the gauge I kept on the workbench. I remembered opening the hood and checking the oil level, topping it off because it was slightly low. But did I touch the brake lines? I tried to visualize my hands near the brake system, tried to remember any tools I might have used, any deliberate action to damage anything. Nothing came. My memory just showed routine maintenance, the same stuff I did every few weeks. But the video showed me saying I did something to cause the accident. Should have gotten rid of them both. The accident should have worked. Next time, no survivors. Those were my exact words in that flat, sleepwalking voice. How could I say something so specific if there wasn't some truth to it? Maybe I'd thought about it while awake, and my sleeping brain just repeated the thoughts? But I'd never consciously thought about killing them, never even in my angriest moments with Tamara or most frustrated moments with Andrew. I rolled over and checked my phone. 2:30 a.m. My alarm was set for 7 because Hunter wanted to meet again first thing to discuss next steps. I closed my eyes and tried to force my brain to shut down, but sleep wouldn't come. Hunter's call came at 7:15, while I was still lying in Dylan's spare bed staring at water stains on the ceiling. My former employer had already sent their full cooperation package to the prosecutors, every detail of my 20-year employment history packaged up like evidence at a crime scene. They emphasized their zero-tolerance drug policy in bold letters across 3 different documents, positioned themselves as victims of an employee who violated their trust and brought shame to the company name. Hunter said they were making my termination look completely justified, turning me from a dedicated worker into a liability they were smart to cut loose. The prosecutors were eating it up because companies cooperating this fast usually meant they had legitimate concerns about employee behavior, not that they were covering their own backs by throwing someone under the bus. I asked Hunter what this meant for my case, and he said it made things harder because now we had to fight both the criminal charges and the narrative that I was an unstable addict who'd been fooling everyone for years. He said he was reaching out to that private investigator he mentioned, someone named Ronan McPherson, who specialized in tracking drug patterns and could maybe prove Andrew was the real problem here. I thanked him and hung up, then spent another hour staring at that ceiling before Dylan knocked and said, breakfast was ready. 3 days later, Ronan called with his first findings. He'd tracked down 2 of Andrew's friends through social media and casual conversations at places they hung out, a coffee shop near our house, and some designer clothing store Andrew frequented. Both friends confirmed Andrew had been using pills for at least 8 months, maybe longer, pills he specifically said came from his dad's prescription. Ronan recorded the conversations with their permission and sent me the audio files. Listening to these kids talk about my son like he was some kind of generous dealer made my stomach turn. One of them described how Andrew would show up at parties with baggies of crushed pills, bragging about his unlimited allowance and free supply from home. The kid said Andrew positioned himself as this rich friend who shared everything, money and drugs, and everyone loved having him around because he made them feel like they were living some luxury lifestyle. Ronan said he had 3 more people to interview, but these 2 were solid witnesses who could testify that Andrew had a long-established pattern of stealing and using my medication. The investigation was building a timeline that proved Andrew brought those drugs to the Bahamas, not that he got them there, or that I was supplying him intentionally. Hunter called that same afternoon to say we had enough evidence now to show reasonable doubt about the airport possession charge, but we still needed to deal with the divorce situation because Tamara was moving fast on that front. He gave me Martina Santoro's number, said she was the best divorce attorney he knew who might take my case despite my financial situation. I called her office and got an appointment for the next morning. Martina's office was in an older building downtown, nothing fancy, which made me feel slightly better about affording her services. She was maybe 50, sharp eyes, no-nonsense handshake. I sat across from her desk and watched her flip through the divorce papers Tamara had filed, her expression getting darker with each page. She finally looked up and explained that because the house was purchased entirely with Tamara's inheritance money, I had no legal claim to it regardless of 20 years of marriage and maintenance. California was a community property state, but inherited assets stayed separate unless they were deliberately mixed with marital funds, and Tamara had been careful to keep everything in her name alone. I felt my chest tighten, because that house represented 2 decades of my life. Every weekend I spent fixing the deck or painting rooms or replacing the water heater, all of it legally meaningless. Martina moved on to the credit card charges, $30,000 in designer replacements for Andrew's destroyed belongings. She said those would be difficult to recover because they occurred before the divorce filing was officially served to me, which meant Tamara could argue she was legitimately replacing marital property I destroyed in a rage. The timing was too perfect. Everything calculated to happen in that narrow window where it was technically legal. The joint account situation was more complex, she said, because while Tamara had the right to access marital funds, emptying the entire account and moving it to her personal account could be seen as hiding assets. But proving that in court would require time and money I didn't have, and Tamara's attorney would argue she was protecting funds from someone who'd just been arrested for drugs and was acting unstable. Martina leaned back in her chair and gave it to me straight. Tamara's wealth and family connections gave her massive advantages in divorce proceedings. Her attorney worked for one of those prestigious firms that specialized in protecting wealthy clients' assets, the kind of place that charged $800 an hour and had judges on speed dial. Meanwhile, I was scraping together legal fees from Dylan's generosity and whatever I could pull from my nearly empty checking account. She said she'd take my case, but I needed to understand we were fighting uphill against someone with unlimited resources and a head start on the legal strategy. I left her office feeling like I'd been kicked in the stomach, walked back to Dylan's car in the parking garage, and sat there for 20 minutes trying to process how completely outmatched I was in every possible way. That evening, Dylan made dinner, some pasta dish he claimed was his specialty, and we ate mostly in silence until he finally said he wanted to loan me $10,000 for legal fees. I started to protest, but he cut me off, said he refused to accept any repayment terms or even discuss paying him back. He reminded me that 3 years ago, when his own divorce was destroying him financially and emotionally, I'd helped him through it, let him stay in my guest room for 2 months, loaned him money I never asked to be repaid. He said this was him returning the favor when I needed it most, and if I tried to refuse, he'd be genuinely insulted. I didn't have the strength to argue, just nodded and thanked him, while trying not to break down completely. The next day, Hunter arranged for me to meet with Nora Savage, a sleep disorder specialist who'd testified as an expert witness in several cases involving sleep disorders and criminal behavior. Her office was attached to a medical clinic on the east side of town, walls covered in diplomas and certifications that made me feel slightly more hopeful she could actually help. Nora had me fill out a detailed medical history form, then spent an hour asking questions about my sleep patterns, when the sleepwalking started, how often it happened, what I typically did while asleep. I explained I'd been sleepwalking since my late 20s, usually just wandering around the house, sometimes talking but never anything coherent, always completely harmless. She asked to see the security camera video, and I pulled it up on my phone with shaking hands, watched her face as she studied me sleepwalking into the bedroom and speaking those horrible words about accidents and survivors. When the video ended, she was quiet for a long moment, then explained that people can say anything while sleepwalking, often incorporating fears or anxieties, or even things they've seen on television, with absolutely no connection to actual memories or real intentions. The sleeping brain pulls from all kinds of sources and creates these random narratives that mean nothing about what the person actually thinks or did while awake. She said she'd testified in 3 cases where sleeping people confessed to crimes they didn't commit, and brain activity studies proved that sleep talking came from a completely different neural process than conscious speech. But then she watched the video again, leaning closer to my phone screen, and said something that made my pulse spike. She noted that the specific phrasing in my sleep talking sounded almost scripted, using phrases like "should have worked," and next time that didn't match natural sleep speech patterns. Real sleep talking was usually fragmented and nonsensical, she explained, but my words formed complete sentences with logical structure. She suspected I might have been responding to audio prompting that wasn't captured on the recording, someone playing suggestions or questions that guided what I said while asleep. The security camera only recorded video in this clip, no ambient audio, which she found suspicious, given that most modern cameras captured both automatically. I thought about what she'd just said, and a memory surfaced from about 2 months back. Tamara had mentioned wanting to upgrade the bedroom camera, said something about better video quality for security purposes. She'd installed the new one herself, spent an afternoon setting it up and testing different angles. I remembered asking why we needed such a fancy camera when the old one worked fine and she'd gotten defensive, said it was her money and she wanted better protection for her jewelry and personal items. The new camera had audio capability built in. I'd seen it in the specs when she left the box on the dresser, but she'd configured it to record video only. At the time, I thought maybe she was worried about privacy, didn't want our conversations recorded while we slept. Now the timing seemed too perfect. She upgraded the camera 2 months ago, and the only footage she's showing me is from last Tuesday, a clip with no ambient audio to verify what else might have been happening in that room while I sleepwalked and talked. I explained this to Nora, watching her expression shift from professional interest to something sharper. She asked to see my phone, pulled up the camera's settings through the app, and confirmed that audio recording was disabled despite the hardware supporting it. She pointed out that most people who install security cameras specifically want audio to capture complete evidence of any incidents, so deliberately disabling that feature raised questions about what someone might not want recorded. Hunter called me that afternoon while I sat in Dylan's living room trying to process everything Nora had told me. He'd found a forensic video analyst named Angie Carlson who specialized in examining security footage for signs of tampering or manipulation. She'd worked on several high-profile cases where video evidence had been questioned, and Hunter thought she could help determine if the sleepwalking clip had been edited or altered in any way. I agreed immediately, desperate for anything that might prove Tamara had manufactured this evidence against me. Hunter set up a meeting for the next morning at Angie's office downtown. She'd need access to the full camera system and all footage from the past 3 months to do a complete analysis, but Hunter warned me that might be a problem since Tamara now controlled access to the house and all its systems. I tried logging into the camera app on my phone and discovered Tamara had already changed the password, locking me out completely. Hunter said we'd need to file a motion to compel access, but that could take weeks, depending on how hard Tamara's attorney fought it. Martina called Hunter, and they conferenced me in to discuss strategy. She wanted to file an emergency motion for me to retrieve personal belongings and access the security camera footage as potential evidence in both the criminal drug case and the divorce proceedings. The motion would argue that I needed my clothes, documents, and other essential items, and that the security footage might contain exculpatory evidence related to the drug charges. Hunter agreed this was the best approach, and Martina said she'd have the paperwork filed by the end of day. 2 days later, we got Tamara's response through her attorney. They opposed the motion completely, claiming I was a danger to the family based on the sleepwalking confession and my violent destruction of Andrew's property. Her attorney argued that allowing me access to the house would give me opportunity to destroy evidence, tamper with the camera system, or harm Tamara and Andrew if they happened to be present. They suggested any personal items I needed could be packed by Tamara and delivered to a neutral location, and that the security footage was Tamara's private property that I had no right to access. The hearing happened 3 days later in front of a judge who looked tired and annoyed at having to deal with what he clearly viewed as a messy domestic dispute. Martina argued that I had every right to retrieve my personal property from the marital home, and that the security footage was potential evidence in a criminal case, not private property that Tamara could withhold. She pointed out the suspicious timing of everything, the coordinated attacks on my employment and finances, and the questionable nature of a video clip that conveniently had no audio despite the camera's capability. Tamara's attorney painted me as an unstable person who'd been arrested for drugs, fired from his job for cause, and had violently destroyed thousands of dollars of his own son's belongings in a rage. He showed the judge photos Andrew had taken of his destroyed suitcase floating in the lake, images I hadn't seen before that made the whole incident look even worse than it was. The judge listened to both sides, asked a few questions about the drug charges and the sleepwalking video, then made his ruling. I could have supervised access to collect essential personal items and download security camera footage, but only with a court-appointed monitor present to document everything I did and ensure nothing was destroyed or tampered with. He gave me a 4-hour window 3 days from that moment and warned that any deviation from the rules would result in contempt charges and possible arrest. Meanwhile, Ronan kept digging into Andrew's background and drug use patterns. He'd been interviewing people in Andrew's social circle, tracking down friends and acquaintances who might know about his drug habits. On the second day of his investigation, he found a dealer who operated near our neighborhood. a guy in his 30s who sold various substances to college kids and young adults in the area. Ronan convinced him to talk by explaining this was about a father trying to clear his name, not about getting anyone arrested for dealing. The dealer confirmed that Andrew had been a regular customer for about a year, buying pills, mushrooms, and occasionally other substances. He remembered Andrew specifically because the kid always paid in cash and bragged about his weekly allowance, called himself a trust fund baby, even though everyone knew he just lived at home with his parents. Most importantly, the dealer confirmed that Andrew had purchased a significant quantity of mushrooms 2 days before our family trip to the Bahamas. Andrew had told him he was going on vacation and wanted to party, asked for enough to last the whole week. The dealer had warned him about taking too much at once, but Andrew had laughed it off and said he knew what he was doing. This information destroyed Tamara's story about Andrew getting the drugs in the Bahamas and just experimenting for the first time. Ronan's investigation proved Andrew had a documented pattern of drug acquisition and use that went back at least a year, probably longer. He was a regular customer with a known dealer, someone who planned ahead and brought drugs on family vacations. The mushrooms he'd taken at the hotel weren't some spontaneous bad decision made in a foreign country. They were part of an established habit that Tamara had either known about and ignored or been too willfully blind to notice. Either way, her claim that she thought he was just experimenting fell apart completely. Ronan documented everything in a detailed report with timestamps, witness statements, and even some text messages the dealer still had from Andrew setting up purchases. Hunter reviewed the report and said this would be crucial for the criminal case, proving that Tamara had lied about the source of the drugs and Andrew's history with substances. The day of my supervised house visit arrived, and I felt sick driving over there with the court monitor following behind me in a separate car. The monitor was a woman in her 50s named Barbara, who explained the rules before we went inside. I could collect personal items like clothes, toiletries, documents, and electronics that were clearly mine. I could access the security camera system to download footage. I could not take anything that belonged to Tamara or Andrew, could not damage or destroy any property, and could not remove anything that might be considered a marital asset subject to division in the divorce. Barbara would document everything I took with photos and a written inventory. Tamara and Andrew were required to be absent during my visit, but as we walked up to the front door, I could see they'd already started erasing me from the house. Through the window, I noticed the family photos that used to line the hallway wall were gone, replaced with pictures of just Tamara and Andrew at various events and vacations. My key still worked in the lock, which surprised me since I'd expected Tamara to change it. Walking through rooms I'd lived in for 15 years as an escorted visitor felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully describe. Everything looked the same, but different. Familiar furniture arranged the way it had always been, but with small changes that showed someone had been deliberately removing my presence. In the living room, my favorite chair was gone, replaced with a decorative table. In the kitchen, my coffee mug collection had been cleared from the shelf. Upstairs in our bedroom, Tamara had moved all my clothes from the closet into garbage bags piled in the corner, like she couldn't stand having them hanging next to hers for one more day. Barbara watched while I sorted through the bags, pulling out what I needed and leaving behind things that didn't matter anymore. I collected my laptop from the home office, found important documents like my birth certificate and passport in the file cabinet, grabbed photo albums from my childhood that my mother had given me years ago. The whole time, Barbara took photos and made notes on her clipboard, treating me like a potential criminal who needed constant monitoring. When I finally accessed the security camera system through the desktop computer in the office, my stomach dropped. Tamara had deleted everything except that one clip from last Tuesday showing my sleepwalking confession. 3 months of continuous footage, gone. The system showed the deletion had happened 2 days ago, right after the judge granted my access to the house. She'd known I was coming and had scrubbed the entire archive, leaving only the one piece of evidence that made me look dangerous. I called Barbara over to document what I was seeing, and she photographed the screen showing the deletion logs and the single remaining video file. I downloaded the one clip to a thumb drive even though I already had it on my phone, just to have an official copy obtained during the supervised visit. Barbara noted in her report that all other footage had been deliberately erased, which she said might be significant, depending on what the court made of it. Later that evening, after I'd moved my belongings into Dylan's spare room and tried to process the surreal experience of being escorted through my own home like a stranger, Angie called. She'd reviewed Barbara's documentation and the photos of the camera system showing the mass deletion. She explained that this was actually significant evidence in my favor, If Tamara genuinely believed the security footage proved I was dangerous and had tried to kill them 7 years ago, why would she delete everything except one isolated clip? A truly frightened person would preserve all footage to document the full pattern of threatening behavior, to show investigators and courts the complete picture of the danger they faced. But Tamara had done the opposite, carefully curating the evidence to show only the most damaging moment while destroying everything else that might provide context or show a different story. Angie said this selective preservation suggested someone controlling a narrative rather than someone genuinely afraid, and she'd be willing to testify to that effect if needed. The deletion itself had become evidence of manipulation, proof that Tamara wasn't acting like a victim, but like someone manufacturing a case against me. I sent Angie the video file from the thumb drive along with screenshots of the deletion logs Barbara had documented. She called me back 2 hours later with news that made my hands shake. The video had been edited, she explained, cut from a longer recording with sections deliberately removed before and after my sleepwalking episode. The metadata showed timestamps where footage had been extracted and the original file deleted, leaving only this isolated 30-second clip. Someone had taken a longer recording and carved out just the part that made me look dangerous, erasing everything that might explain what I was responding to or what happened before and after. Angie walked me through the technical details, pointing out file creation dates that didn't match the recording date, compression artifacts that indicated multiple saves and timeline gaps in the footage sequence. This wasn't someone preserving evidence of genuine fear. This was someone carefully building a weapon to use against me. 2 days later, Hunter met with the prosecutor handling my drug case, bringing Angie's technical analysis, Ronan's documentation of Andrew's year-long drug use pattern, the pharmacy records showing my legitimate prescription, and responsible refill history and transcripts from witness interviews confirming Andrew had been stealing and using my medication for months. Hunter laid it all out systematically, showing how the pills found in my bag matched my prescription exactly, how Tamara had admitted to planting them during our phone call even though I hadn't recorded it, and how the manipulated security footage proved a pattern of evidence manufacturing rather than genuine concern. The prosecutor reviewed everything for over an hour, asking questions about timeline details and verification of sources. When she finally looked up from the documents, her expression had shifted from confident prosecution to reluctant doubt. The case wasn't as clean as it had appeared initially, she admitted, and the pattern of planted evidence and witness manipulation created reasonable doubt about my guilt. 3 weeks crawled by while the prosecutor's office reviewed the evidence and decided how to proceed. I stayed in Dylan's spare room, attending meetings with Martina about the divorce case and trying not to check my phone every 5 minutes for updates. The waiting felt worse than the initial arrest. This limbo state where my entire future hung on decisions being made in offices I couldn't access by people I couldn't talk to. Finally, on a Tuesday morning, Hunter called with news. The prosecutor was offering a deal to drop the felony possession charges down to simple possession with pretrial diversion. If I completed drug counseling and 6 months of probation without any violations, the charges would be dismissed entirely and wouldn't appear on my permanent record. It wasn't the complete dismissal I wanted, but Hunter explained it was actually a solid outcome given how bad things had looked initially. Hunter laid out the reality in his office that afternoon, speaking plainly about the risks of fighting for complete dismissal. We had good evidence of reasonable doubt, he said, but juries were unpredictable, and prosecutors didn't like losing cases they'd already invested time in. If we went to trial and lost, I'd face actual jail time and a permanent felony record that would destroy any chance of rebuilding my career. The pretrial diversion meant admitting to simple possession, which felt like accepting guilt I didn't deserve, but it gave me a path to a clean record if I completed all the requirements. I sat there staring at the paperwork, hating every word of it, but finally signed because the alternative risked losing everything permanently. The relief of having the criminal case resolved, mixed with bitter anger at having to accept any guilt at all when Tamara had orchestrated the entire situation. With the criminal charges settled, Martina shifted her full attention to the divorce proceedings. She filed motions to recover the $30,000 Tamara had charged to my credit cards, arguing these weren't legitimate marital expenses, but deliberate retaliation for destroyed property. She also demanded return of half the joint account funds Tamara had moved to her personal account, pointing out that emptying shared accounts without notice violated basic fairness, even if it was technically legal under marital asset laws. Martina built her argument carefully, documenting the timeline of events to show how Tamara's actions came immediately after the luggage incident and were designed to punish rather than protect. She submitted Ronan's investigation showing Andrew's long-term drug problem that Tamara had known about and concealed, using this to demonstrate that Tamara's claims of acting from fear were manufactured rather than genuine. Tamara's attorney responded 2 weeks later with a filing that made my stomach drop. They presented the sleepwalking video prominently, building a narrative that I was an unstable person who had destroyed Andrew's belongings in a violent rage, gotten arrested for drug possession, and potentially tried to murder both Tamara and Andrew 7 years ago by sabotaging their car. The filing painted Tamara as a frightened wife who had finally gathered the courage to leave a dangerous husband, taking necessary protective actions to secure assets and ensure her safety. They argued that replacing Andrew's destroyed items wasn't retaliation, but reasonable compensation for property I had violently thrown in a lake, and that moving joint account funds was justified protection from someone exhibiting increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. The whole document read like a horror story with me as the villain, and seeing my life twisted into that narrative made me physically sick. Martina countered with Ronan's complete investigation file, showing Andrew's documented drug purchases from multiple dealers over the past year, witness statements confirming his regular drug use at parties, and evidence that Tamara had known about the problem for months, but chose to enable it rather than seek help. She argued that Tamara's retaliation wasn't the action of a frightened victim, but the calculated response of someone who had been controlling family dynamics for years and refused to accept any challenge to that control. The filing included Angie's technical analysis of the manipulated video, the mechanic's original report on the car accident showing natural brake failure rather than sabotage, and documentation of how Tamara had systematically destroyed my employment, housing, and financial stability within hours of a single angry outburst. Martina painted a picture of someone who had weaponized the legal system and manufactured evidence to punish a husband who had finally pushed back against years of enabling their son's destructive behavior. I started court-ordered drug counseling the following week, sitting in a small office with beige walls and motivational posters, while a counselor named Rita asked me about my substance use history. I explained honestly that I took prescription oxycodone for chronic back pain, always as directed, never early refills or dose increases, and that I had no history of recreational drug use or addiction. Rita listened carefully, reviewing the documentation I'd brought showing my prescription history and pharmacy records. After 3 sessions, she told me plainly that I clearly didn't have a substance abuse problem, but that I still needed to complete all 12 required sessions and pass random drug screens to satisfy the pre-trial diversion requirements. So I showed up every week, participated in the discussions about addiction triggers and recovery strategies that didn't apply to my situation, and peed in cups to prove I was clean. The whole process felt absurd, given that I'd never had a drug problem to begin with, but I did everything exactly as required because my clean record depended on completing this pointless charade. Ronan called 3 days later with news about the mechanic. The guy's name was Frank Delacroix, retired now but still living in the same town where the accident happened 7 years ago. He remembered our case because the insurance company had pushed hard for a sabotage finding to deny the claim, but his inspection proved otherwise. Frank agreed to meet with Ronan and review his original documentation. Ronan drove out there with Angie, who wanted to photograph the original inspection report for our records. Frank pulled out a thick file from his garage storage, pages yellowed but notes still clear. He documented everything: measurements of the corroded brake lines, photos of the failure point, comparison samples from similar aged vehicles. The corrosion pattern showed years of gradual deterioration, not fresh damage. Frank explained that brake lines on that model were known for premature rust in humid climates, and ours had been on the road for 9 years when they failed. The critical detail was timing. Frank told Ronan that if someone had cut or deliberately damaged the brake lines that morning like Tamara claimed, the failure would have been immediate or within minutes of driving. Brake fluid would have leaked out fast, pressure would have dropped right away, and the pedal would have gone to the floor before they even left our neighborhood. But Tamara and Andrew had driven 6 hours before the brakes failed on that mountain descent. That delay proved the failure came from natural deterioration that happened to reach its breaking point during their trip, not from any tampering I could have done that morning. Frank's notes included the exact timeline. They left our house at 9 in the morning. The accident happened at 3 in the afternoon. In between, they'd made 2 stops for gas and food, driving normally with no brake issues. The gradual failure pattern matched classic age-related corrosion, and Frank had seen dozens of similar cases over his career. He'd be willing to testify to all of this if needed. Martina received Ronan's report and Frank's documentation 2 weeks before our divorce hearing. She spent days preparing her presentation, organizing the evidence into a clear narrative that contradicted everything Tamara's attorney had claimed. The sleepwalking video showed me saying things about sabotage, but the physical evidence proved those words couldn't represent actual events. Even if I had said those things while asleep, which I had no memory of and no control over, the mechanical reality made the confession impossible. The divorce hearing took place in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and anxiety. I sat next to Martina at a long table, while Tamara and her attorney occupied the other side. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Moreau, who'd been handling family law cases for 30 years, according to Martina's research. She had a reputation for cutting through emotional manipulation to focus on facts. Tamara's attorney went first, presenting their narrative about my instability and dangerous behavior. He showed the sleepwalking video, emphasizing my words about the accident and survivors. He talked about my drug arrest, the destroyed property in the Bahamas, my termination from work. He painted me as someone whose mask had finally slipped, revealing a violent and unstable person underneath. Tamara sat there looking frightened and vulnerable, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Then Martina stood up with her organized files and started dismantling their story piece by piece. She presented Ronan's investigation showing Andrew's year-long pattern of drug purchases and use. She showed witness statements from people who'd seen Andrew using pills at parties months before the Bahamas trip. She presented my pharmacy records proving I'd never sought early refills or shown any signs of prescription abuse. She played Angie's analysis of the manipulated security video, showing how footage had been deliberately edited and deleted. And then she brought out Frank's mechanical inspection report. Martina walked the judge through the brake line evidence slowly and clearly. She explained the corrosion pattern, the timeline of the drive, the impossibility of sabotage causing a failure 6 hours later. She showed Frank's photos and measurements, his expert conclusions, his willingness to testify. She pointed out that even if the sleepwalking video showed me saying those words, which happened during a sleep disorder I couldn't control, the physical evidence proved I couldn't have caused the accident through any action that morning. Judge Moreau asked several questions about the brake line analysis, clearly interested in the technical details. She asked Tamara's attorney if he had any expert testimony contradicting Frank's findings. He didn't. She asked if they had any evidence I'd tampered with the car at any other time before the trip. They didn't. She asked why Tamara had deleted all other security footage except the one clip showing my sleep talking. He claimed it was accidental, but his voice sounded uncertain. Martina then presented the timeline of Tamara's retaliation. The drugs planted in my bag at the airport, the immediate emptying of joint accounts, the $30,000 in charges on my credit cards, the call to my employer reporting a drug problem, the divorce papers filed before I even knew what was happening. She argued this wasn't the behavior of someone acting in fear, but someone executing a planned punishment for challenging her control over Andrew. The judge's expression grew skeptical as Martina laid out the evidence. She kept looking at Tamara with narrowed eyes, then back at the documentation. When Martina finished, Judge Moreau called a recess and said she needed time to review everything carefully. During the break, I stood in the hallway with Martina, while Tamara and her attorney huddled in a corner, having an intense whispered conversation. After 20 minutes, Tamara's attorney approached us with a different expression than before. He asked if we'd be willing to discuss settlement rather than continuing the hearing. Martina glanced at me, and I nodded. We followed him to a small conference room down the hall. The settlement negotiations stretched across 2 full days of back-and-forth meetings. Tamara wanted to keep the house, which was legally hers anyway through her inheritance. She wanted all her family assets protected. She wanted to pay minimal spousal support since the marriage was ending due to my alleged instability. Her attorney kept trying to frame everything around the fear narrative, but it was falling apart now that the judge had seen the contradicting evidence. I wanted the $40,000 back that represented half the joint account, plus the fraudulent credit card charges. I wanted my name cleared regarding the car accident, with a written statement admitting it was mechanical failure. I wanted to keep my retirement account that I'd built over 20 years of work. Martina pushed hard on all these points, using the judge's obvious skepticism as leverage. Tamara's attorney kept trying to negotiate down the money, offering $25,000, then $30,000. Martina held firm at $40,000, pointing out that their case was crumbling and the judge might award me even more if we went back to court. They argued about the written statement regarding the accident, with Tamara's attorney claiming it was unnecessary. Martina insisted it was essential for clearing my reputation and preventing future accusations. On the second day of mediation, we finally reached an agreement. Tamara would keep the house and all her inheritance assets. She would pay me $40,000 representing half the joint account and the credit card charges. She would sign a written statement acknowledging that the car accident 7 years ago was caused by mechanical failure from brake line corrosion, not sabotage or tampering. I would receive no ongoing spousal support, but I'd be released from all marital debts and would keep my full retirement account. It wasn't fair, given everything I'd contributed to the marriage over 20 years, but it was better than walking away with nothing while she controlled everything. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks after Tamara first filed the papers. I'd lost my home, my job, most of my savings, and 20 years of marriage. But I was legally clear of the drug charges after completing the diversion program, and I had written proof that the accident accusations were false. The settlement gave me enough money to start rebuilding, even though it felt like starting from zero at my age. 2 days after the divorce was final, my phone rang with a number I recognized. Elias Tran, who'd worked in my department for 5 years before moving to a smaller tech company across town. We'd been friendly colleagues, sometimes getting lunch together, and he'd sent a supportive email when he heard about my termination. His voice sounded warm when I answered. Elias told me his company was hiring for a position that matched my experience and skills. It was a smaller operation than my previous employer, less corporate structure, but solid work with room for growth. He'd already talked to the hiring manager about me, explained the circumstances of my termination, and vouched for my character and abilities. The manager was willing to interview me if I was interested in starting over somewhere new. I told Elias I'd like to interview, and he set something up for the following week. The hiring manager's name was Sarah Brennan, and she ran the engineering division at a mid-sized tech company that built data management systems for healthcare providers. I showed up 15 minutes early wearing the one decent suit I still owned, the same one I'd worn to court proceedings over the past 2 months. Sarah shook my hand and led me to a small conference room with windows overlooking a parking lot instead of the downtown skyline views I'd gotten used to at my old office. She asked about my experience, my technical skills, my management approach, all the standard questions. Then she paused and looked at her notes. She said Elias had explained my situation, but she wanted to hear it from me directly, why I'd left my previous position after 20 years. I took a breath and told her the truth. My wife planted prescription drugs in my luggage at an airport to retaliate for a family argument. I got arrested. My employer terminated me under their zero-tolerance policy before I could explain. And I'd spent the past 2 months fighting criminal charges that were eventually dismissed through a diversion program. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. When I finished, she asked if I had documentation of the dismissal and the case resolution. I pulled out the folder Martina had prepared, copies of the court documents showing the charges were dropped, a letter from Hunter explaining the circumstances, and a statement from the diversion program confirming I'd completed all requirements. Sarah reviewed each document carefully, then said she'd need to check my references and verify my account with former colleagues. She called 3 people I'd worked with for over a decade, putting them on speaker so I could hear. Each one confirmed I'd been a reliable employee, a good manager, and that everyone at the company knew I'd been set up by my wife during a divorce. One of them, Gregory from the infrastructure team, said flat out that my termination was corporate politics covering their ass, not a reflection of my character or abilities. Sarah thanked them and ended the calls. She looked at me across the table and said she appreciated my honesty, that most people in my position would have tried to hide or minimize what happened. She explained the role was senior engineer rather than management. The salary was $68,000 compared to my previous $115,000, and the benefits package was basic but adequate. She said she'd discuss it with her team and get back to me within 3 days. Sarah called 2 days later and offered me the position. I accepted immediately, relief flooding through me so hard I had to sit down. The pay cut stung, the step down in responsibility felt like failure, but it was legitimate employment when I'd thought my career was finished. I started the following Monday, spending the first week in orientation and getting set up with new equipment and system access. The office was smaller, the technology older, the projects less ambitious than what I'd worked on before, but everyone treated me normally. No whispers about drug arrests or criminal records, just standard new employee adjustment. Elias took me to lunch the first Friday and asked how I was holding up. I told him I was grateful, that he'd saved my life by reaching out when he did. He waved that off and said good people deserved second chances, especially when the first chance got stolen by someone else's malice. 3 weeks into the new job, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. Andrew. I stared at the screen for 5 rings before answering. His voice sounded uncertain, asking if we could meet to talk. I asked why. After everything that happened, he thought I'd want to see him. He said he'd been in treatment, that he was trying to make things right, and he understood if I refused, but he needed to try. Against every instinct telling me to hang up, I agreed to meet at a coffee shop near Dylan's apartment, neutral territory where I could leave if necessary. I told Andrew to come alone, but I was bringing Dylan for support. He agreed without argument. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon, 2 days away. I told Dylan about it that night, and he insisted on coming, said there was no way I was facing Andrew alone after what he'd done. Saturday came, and I drove to the coffee shop with Dylan, my stomach tight with nerves I didn't want to admit. We got there early and took a table near the back with clear views of the entrance. Andrew walked in 20 minutes later and I barely recognized him. He'd lost maybe 30 pounds, his designer clothes hanging loose on a frame that looked skeletal. His skin had a gray tint, his hands shook slightly as he ordered coffee, and his eyes had dark circles that makeup couldn't hide. He sat down across from me, Dylan beside me in silent support. Andrew started talking before I could say anything. He'd been in outpatient rehab for 5 weeks, attending meetings every day and working with a counselor on his addiction issues. Tamara had finally acknowledged he had a drug problem after he'd gotten so sick she had to take him to the emergency room 3 weeks after we got back from the Bahamas. He said he was sorry, the words coming out halting and rehearsed, for planting the pills in my bag at the airport. He claimed Tamara had convinced him it was fair payback, that I'd destroyed his property so he should cause me problems too, that it was just supposed to delay my flight and teach me a lesson. I listened without responding, watching him fidget with his coffee cup. Then I asked the question that had been eating at me for months. Did he really believe I tried to kill him and Tamara 7 years ago by sabotaging the car? Andrew went quiet, staring at his hands for what felt like minutes. Finally, he said he didn't actually remember much about the accident since he'd been 17 and traumatized by the crash. He remembered the car rolling, the glass breaking, waking up in the hospital with a concussion and broken arm. But the story about me tampering with the brakes, that came from Tamara. She'd told him about it over and over through the years, explaining why I was dangerous, why she had to protect them, why she controlled the money and made all the decisions. He'd heard it so many times he started believing it was his own memory instead of her narrative. Now, after weeks of therapy and distance from her constant influence, he was realizing how much she'd controlled both of us. Andrew said he was starting to understand that Tamara had spent years turning us against each other, enabling his worst behaviors while making me the enemy, creating a dynamic where he'd always choose her side because she gave him everything he wanted. The therapist at rehab had helped him see how the unlimited money and zero boundaries had damaged him, made him unable to function as an adult, kept him dependent on her approval and support. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to rebuild a relationship, he said. He just wanted to acknowledge the damage and his part in it, to admit that he'd been wrong to help destroy my life, even if Tamara had convinced him it was justified. I sat there looking at this thin, shaking version of my son and felt something complicated I couldn't name. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but maybe recognition that he'd been damaged by the same person who'd tried to destroy me. I told him I hoped he got the help he needed, that maybe someday when we'd both healed, we could have an honest conversation about our family and what went wrong. But right now, I needed distance to rebuild my own life, to figure out who I was without the constant attacks and manipulation. Andrew nodded and said he understood. He finished his coffee, stood up carefully like his legs weren't quite steady, and left the shop looking lost and small. Dylan and I sat there in silence for a while after he was gone. Finally, Dylan asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know, but at least now I understood that Andrew had been another victim of Tamara's control, even if he'd chosen to participate in destroying me. 6 months after that nightmare birthday trip to the Bahamas, I was living in a small one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but clean and mine. I'd completed the drug diversion program and received official notice that the charges were dismissed, my record clear. The settlement money from Tamara had covered first and last month's rent, basic furniture from discount stores and enough cushion to survive while I adjusted to my lower salary. I was working at the tech company, getting positive reviews from Sarah, slowly rebuilding professional credibility, one project at a time. My retirement account was intact, my credit cards were paid off, and I had $3,000 in savings, more than I'd had in months. I'd lost the house I'd lived in for 15 years, the job I'd built over 20 years, most of my savings, and a marriage that had apparently been built on control and resentment rather than partnership. Some wounds would never fully heal, scars that would ache when I thought about everything that happened. But I was standing on my own for the first time in decades, making my own decisions, supporting myself without anyone's permission or approval, and there was something solid about that. I wasn't rich, wasn't successful by my old standards, wasn't living the life I'd planned. But I was free from people who'd tried to destroy me, and I was building something new from the pieces they'd left behind. That had to count for something.